I mean, the trouble with these introductions is that at my age they get to sound like obituaries. And you sort of feel, well, perhaps I should now keel over, and then you can add the funny stuff. I'm delighted to be here. I can't remember when I was last at ODI. It's a very long time ago. And so it's really especially nice to be here and to see you all. Also a number of familiar faces in the audience. I'm not going to answer all those questions. You know, that's the master's degree, which you can have later on. One of the questions in there is how do you produce new technologies, is actually in this book, what I wrote, as it were. And if you want a copy of that, you just pick up one of these memory sticks. It's free. And there's several chapters in there about the nature of innovation, and I think that gets to those questions. I think we can also, in the discussion, debate who should determine what kind of technology should be produced and who should assess whether it's the right kind of technology. I'm not going to do that. I'm also simply going to talk about that particular question. We've decided it probably should be the word which, not what. But given we've got one economist and one ecologist, it's difficult. There's probably somebody in the audience who's got a degree in English literature who can tell us whether it should be which or what. No, there isn't one. ODI is obviously lacking in English lit as well. And so what I'm going to talk about is really only a subset of a much bigger set of questions which I'm working on, because one of the things I'm doing is trying to write a second edition for the Doubly Green Revolution. It's part of the new grant that we've got from the Gates Foundation. I've got to point at something. I've done it. Part of the context you're familiar with. Part of it is that food price spike. Interesting spike because, as you can see, it did all the classic things a food price spike does. It went up, top 2008, and then came down. But then, of course, it didn't stay down. If you look at 2009, it started going back up again. In 2010, it's not back up to where it was in 2008, but it is high. There's all kinds of qualifications to this. The 2010 figures are more about sugar than they are about cereals. But we do know that the impact of the spike persists. You can see it here with the price of maize in Kenya. World price has come down. The price of maize in Kenya has actually continued to go up since the peak of the spike. And we all know what we've got as a consequence. We've got just over 1 billion people who are chronically hungry. And we've got to somehow increase food production by something between 70 and 100%, depending upon who you listen to. FAO says 100%, Greenpeace says 70%. Other people say we could all become vegetarians and then we wouldn't have to increase it at all, and so on. But it's a lot. This is a big challenge. It's worth remembering that this is a big challenge. And the challenges of this nature, I like to think about these crises in terms of the English cottage loaf. I live down in Sussex, and this is the loaf of bread that we make, which you've got a large bit on the bottom and a small bit twirling out of the top. And your immediate crisis is the bit that turns out of the top. And that's true of all these crises. You know, whether it's a financial crisis with banks collapsing, or whether it's a terrorist attack, or whatever. And the problem is that politicians and the media go from one immediate crisis to another immediate crisis, because that's all they can do. And what we have to do, what people who are analysts have to do, is to worry about the chronic crisis underneath. And that chronic crisis of food production and agricultural development generally is affected by a whole range of drivers. I put them all up there. And each one of those is worthy of 1 or 2 lectures on their own. In other words, that's a complete master's degree in itself, to go through each of those drivers, what happens, what the consequences are. And I'm not going to do that. Where are we now? What we've got as a result of that crisis is rhetoric and the potential funding at the top, which we can talk about later if you want. I've just spent a session at the House of Lords with the Deputy Head of Mission for the American Embassy, presenting the new American Feed the Future program, which is meant to be 3.5 billion of new money, but won't be 3.5 billion of new money. And what you've got on the ground is an enormous number of achievements. You go anywhere in Africa, any village you go to, and there'll be a little project of one kind or another that's working quite well. Everywhere, there's one project after another. And so what's the gap between that rhetoric and on the ground, and how do you bridge that gap? It's one of the things we're working on in the Gates grant that we've got at the moment. There are various ways you can bridge it. There's the issues of various partnerships and committees. There's the World Bank Trust Fund. There's Feed the Future, I've mentioned. There's CADAP and AGRA, which you're all probably familiar with. There's the actual development of new budgets and policies in the developing countries. There's the importance of a theory of change to bridge the gap. And then there's the issue of scaling up. And it's the last 2 of those that we're focusing on in our grant. And I'll just mention the scaling up at the end, and maybe we can talk about it. Another way of looking at all of this is to say, if the food prices are so high, why can't developing country farmers respond? In 2008, prices shot up. You'd think all those African farmers would be out there growing maize or whatever else like crazy to make lots of money. I live, as I said, down in Sussex, and all the farmers near where I live, that's exactly what they did. Several of the farms near where I live grow turfs. They grow grass turfs on their fields. Very high quality turfs for sale to householders who want new lawns. Make a lot of money out of those. And they dug them all up and started growing wheat and barley because they were making more money. African farmers didn't do it. And of course, the reason why African farmers didn't do it is there are all these barriers, all that list of barriers you can see on the screen. And the problem is that the mix of barriers, the mix of challenges, changes from one place to another. It's not the same list in Mali as it is in Malawi, certainly not by priority. So what we actually need are some diagnostics that will get us to understanding what it is that we can do. By we, I mean everybody involved in agricultural development. And one way of looking at this is to think about, first of all, place, in other words, a particular place, or value chain, a particular value chain, and then try and work out where the barriers are to development and what kind of diagnostics you need and what kind of interventions are going to be appropriate. So in this place in Western Kenya, this may be the biggest barrier, and therefore we need to intervene in this way. This value chain for, say, coffee production in Ghana or wherever may need this kind of intervention. So, leading into what I'm going to talk about, part of what we need are appropriate interventions. And I'm assuming here that you can have interventions of lots of different kinds. Not just technical, which is what I'm going to talk about, but by financial information and so on. So what I'm going to talk about, you can replicate again for all the range of interventions. This talks a bit like a Russian doll, isn't it? I keep peeling off yet another lot, and there's another great long list that you have to think about. And of course, you've got to work out what is appropriate. Does it work? Does it add significant value? Is it resilient? Is it equitable? In other words, do poor people benefit from it? Are there downsides? And what's the counterfactual? What happens if you don't do it? Simple set of questions. Take a little bit to answer, but they're a relatively simple set of questions that you need to ask of every intervention, not just the technologies. So, I would say that there are 4 different kinds of technology that can be appropriate. They can be traditional, or intermediate, conventional, or new platform technologies. And that's what I'm going to talk about, because that's what I was asked to talk about. Traditional, pretty straightforward. Sometimes effective, sometimes I'm a bit doubtful. Scared the living daylights out of me, but I don't know what it did to all the pests. This is in Zimbabwe. A very powerful traditional technology is the home garden. You know, that very intimate collection of plants and animals within the homestead of a farmer, which provides an enormous diversity of foodstuffs and stuffs for sale, growing in a very intricate ecological environment. It comes to its peak in Java, called the pekarangan, but you will find them nearly everywhere you go. In many cases, they're just very simple, but in other cases, they are developing. People are themselves evolving more intricate home gardens. Another traditional technology is to grow what is effectively a wild plant, or just to harvest it, for that matter. On the left, Artemisia, which of course produces artemisinin, the drug for treatment of malaria, which the Chinese have worked on for years and is now the standard drug for use in treating malaria in Africa. On the right, argan oil, which is a very drought-resistant tree in Morocco and elsewhere. Morocco, as you know, has got a massive drought that began in about 1970 or so. The barley simply doesn't grow very well now, and they're looking for something to subsist on. And the argan tree produces this something like an olive oil. It grows on the hillsides around the villages, and you can process it into an olive oil-like product or into some kind of cosmetic. Conventional technologies continue to be important and will continue to be important, but the real emphasis here is making them more precise. That's, of course, what we're doing in the West with precision drilling of fertilizer and so on. A good example here is deep placement of supergranules, ultra supergranules, urea supergranules, in which you, instead of distributing the fertilizer across the field, you can put one little briquette every 4 plants. It works, it cuts down the amount you have to apply, and the yields increase as a result, and the income does in particular. Another example is controlling striga, this terrible weed of Africa, a rather beautiful weed, but it just shows you that just because something's beautiful doesn't mean it's nice. There is now a maize that's resistant to a herbicide called imazapyr, and you can coat the seed of the maize with the imazapyr, and as the maize plant grows, the herbicide is passed out from the maize plant and kills the striga. So it's simple to administer. You just sell people the maize seed that's coated with the imazapyr. It doesn't have much environmental effect because it is just localized. And it works well because it doesn't kill the maize plant. Any other kind of herbicide, you get dead maize plants as well. Intermediate technologies are basically technologies which combine something of the conventional with something of the traditional in one way or another. These definitions are not that hard and fast, but I think most of you would recognize what I'm talking about. Here in Ningxia province in northern China up on the Mongolian border, I went there, I don't know, a couple of years ago and spent 2 days traveling around. And everywhere we went, we would be met by the mayor of the municipality. It's a Muslim province in the north. And they would welcome us, we'd have a big feast, and then they'd say, come and see our experiment. And in those couple of days, I counted 38 different experiments on simple ways of conserving water. I also ate a lot of good food and drank an enormous amount. It's the hazard of being the leader of a delegation in China. You can see a lot of this is use of plastic. They're getting biodegradable plastic, but a whole lot of other techniques they've got here. It's a very interesting example of Chinese experimentation. It follows the precept of Hu Jintao, who says, he talks about scientifically based development. Now, he doesn't mean what we mean by the word science. It's really more about experiment-based. And the idea is that you try something out on a small scale, and if it works, you replicate it. If it doesn't work, you kill it. It's not quite the same as doing randomized analysis of variance trials. But, you know, in the long term, it may be very effective, and it certainly works in China. Classic intermediate technology, treadle pumps, linked with very simple drip irrigation, very effective for growing market garden type vegetables. We've had treadle pumps for a very long time, and different NGOs and organizations claim that they either invented it or it's the best. Basically, it all works now because it's foolproof, or virtually foolproof. The problem with so-called intermediate technologies in the past was that they usually broke down. You know, when I lived in India, I remember you'd go to a village and the village, you'd be proudly shown some kind of biogas plant cooker or something. And you'd go there and you'd see it, and it was rather shiny, and it was cooking away. And you knew that if you went back a week later, when the technician wasn't there, it would have not worked. That's not true now. Commercial sector has become involved, and we've really got very good intermediate machinery of this kind. Another, of course, is various kinds of ecological cropping, if you like. This is growing legumes between maize, 2 rows of legumes, 2 rows of maize, called imbili in Uganda and Western Kenya. Works extremely well. You get 5 tons of maize and a ton of peanuts or soybean out of it. Good system. The only problem is it's seen as quite a hassle by farmers. These very intricate ecological systems work extremely well on farmers' fields with experimenters doing it, or in the laboratory, but they don't necessarily, or in an experiment station, but they don't necessarily spread naturally. There's a classic story of at IITA doing a agroforestry trial where you've got 1 row of trees and 2 rows of crop and 1 row of trees, and they went to inspect it, and the farmer said, "Yeah, it's doing very well. It's a great crop." He said, "But these damn trees keep coming up." He said. Conservation farming in Zimbabwe, another example. Instead of ploughing, you cut down the maize, you let the stalk lie on the surface of the ground, you dig little pockets in the ground, which you put the maize in. It grows up through the maize, as in the bottom picture on the left here. And it helps to preserve moisture and the soil. The top picture shows a ploughed field. The bottom shows where it's had that conservation approach for 3 years. Top picture, I kicked the soil and you can see it's dry and sandy. Bottom, I kicked it, it's wet and sticky. It works. It doesn't even really have much of a labour requirement. The first 2 or 3 years, you've got to get rid of weeds. But after that, it pretty well works without any extra weeding. And even though you've got to dig the little holes, you can dig them over 6 months. You don't have to dig them all at once. And of course, the problem with ploughing, you've usually got to wait for the ploughman or your neighbour to come around with the animal. It's one of those things that is so good, the way it's described here, that it does naturally move from farmer to farmer, and I'll talk about that later on. And then there are the new platform technologies, the biotechnologies and nanotechnologies, information and communication. Biotechnologies. What you're trying to do with biotechnologies is build the sustainability into the seed or the animal. So instead of designing an ecological system that's sustainable, you build it into the seed. And if you can do that, it's a lot easier to manage, it's a lot easier to distribute, as it were, and to get people to take up. And we know that we're going to need, because of climate change in particular, but other reasons, increased efficiency of taking up nutrients, utilising sunlight, so on and so forth, and resisting pests and drought. Now, you can do a great deal by conventional breeding, and this is something I've just been writing about in the last week for my 2nd edition. I got quite fascinated with this, something I knew nothing about. Some of you probably may know a great deal about it. Brachiaria is a grass, basically African or Australian, which was imported into tropical America about 30 years ago and now occupies 70 million hectares. In other words, it's nearly a third of the whole of the tropical savannas of the Americas by this imported grass. It's ideal in many respects, but it's prone to degradation, and one answer to that is to interplant it with a legume, and it turns out the only legume that really works with it is Arachis pintoi. So that's one problem. Another is that some of the cultivars are prone to attacks by spittlebugs, but are good at resisting acid soils, or tolerant of acid soils. Some of the other cultivars are resistant to spittlebugs and tolerant of acid soils. So the simple answer is to cross them. The problem is that most of the species that you're looking at are apomictic. So crossing is extremely difficult. But they've cracked it. Complicated business, taking a diploid species that is sexual, applying a compound called colchicine, which doubles its ploidy, so it becomes quadruploid or tetraploid, and is sexual. And then you could take the sexual tetraploid and cross it with these other 2 species and bring them all together. Now, I described that because that is conventional breeding, right? But it's highly technological. It involves dramatic changes in the plant. And one needs to bear that in mind when we start thinking about the other kinds of biotechnology. Tissue culture, in this case, again, it's a cross, the new rice is for Africa, between the African rice and the Asian rice, 2 different species, which very, very rarely will cross naturally. But you have to try and get them to cross. And the only way you can do it is getting them to cross and then take the embryo and put the embryo in a culture and cultivate it out of the culture and get your new variety. And this is the work by Monty Jones. We funded it at Rockefeller. He couldn't get it to work. And so we said to him, why don't you go to China? They know how to do it, I'm sure. He went to China and he said, this is my problem. They shook their heads and said, very easy, put coconut oil in the culture. We put coconut oil in the culture and the thing worked. And that's why we've got the new rices for Africa. But it's worth remembering that those kinds of techniques, those tissue kinds of techniques, you don't pretty much know what's going on. Some of the most advanced tissue culture techniques are to take two diploid cells, strip the cell walls, fuse them together, and then put that in a culture. And you get all kinds of weird things out of that. But that's tissue culture, it's not genetic engineering, so nobody really worries about it. There's the new rices growing. They look like they're growing in Asia. And all of you in the room who come from Asia will look at that and say, that's a really good field of Asian rice. It's not, it's a field of African rice growing in Uganda. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's happening in conventional breeding is using marker-aided selection, where when you cross, you know immediately what you've got because you can detect the DNA. And to speed all that up, Monsanto's got a machine called a chipper. Basically what happens is this, it's an extraordinary machine. All the maize seeds that they're using in their experiments come down a chute. Right? And as they get to the end of the chute, they're photographed. And they're swiveled so they're in the right position. And then a little blade comes along and chips out the top of the maize seed. They then analyze the DNA in the top of the maize seed. They take it and put it here, and put a barcode on the back, and send it off to all the experiments all around the world. So they actually know what is the DNA of every single maize plant in every single experimental field anywhere in the world. And so you could speed up the breeding process because you know what you're getting every time you cross. You can get new varieties in 3 to 5 years instead of the normal 7 to 10 years. And then finally, of course, we've got GM, where you're moving individual genes, or pretty much individual genes, from one plant to another. It's the next extension of these processes, and as you can see, they're rapidly increasing in the developing world, but also in the industrialized world. Now something like 14 million farmers growing GM crops, internationally about 120 million hectares. 13 million of those farmers are small farmers mostly growing BT cotton. So it's huge throughout the world. And we can talk about that later. As you know, there's a likelihood that the UK will approve GM in the next few months. There's quite a lot going on in Africa. This is Ugandan biotechnology lab. They're transforming bananas. It's a favorite slide of mine because I show this usually to say, this is one of Africa's leading biotechnologists. This lady here, one of the great biotechnology scientists in Africa. When I was doing this, not the same talk, but I've changed it a bit since then, but about 2 years ago in Rwanda, I suddenly say, this is this lady and she's a great example, and everybody starts laughing. And I think, oh dear, what have I done? And then they all point to somebody in the front row, and I look down, and there she is. And I said, Defrose, what are you doing here? She said, I'm the Minister of Agriculture, she said. And we didn't know she was Rwandan. we thought she was Ugandan. And then Rockefeller, we'd given her a postdoc, I think, to come to the John Innes Institute in Britain. And it wasn't to that point that we realised she was a Rwandan refugee and not a Ugandan. There's about half a dozen or more African countries that are doing, now doing controlled experiments with GM crops under greenhouses and partly in the field. The big challenge, of course, is finding GM crops that are really going to be a benefit to developing countries. One of them, of course, is golden rice, where you've got a lack of beta-carotene, which is the precursor of vitamin A, in rice, in the rice grain. It's in the leaves and in the stems, but it's not in the grain. And a lack of beta-carotene means a lack of vitamin A, and we've got about 2 million children a year who die because of a lack of vitamin A. And these new varieties of rice have got the beta-carotene in, and the newest ones have got plenty of beta-carotene in, enough to provide sufficient vitamin A for children, and in particular for weaning babies. Another example of something, oh, there isn't another example. I cut that one out. But there are other examples that we need to be looking at where you can find a really clear benefit, and that's what's important. Nanotechnology is all very much in the future, and you can see a range of different potentials for nanotechnological approaches. Interestingly, there's not much concern, not much public concern about the downsides of nanotechnology. And I think they're quite serious, actually. I think they're much more serious than biotechnology, but nobody seems to be that concerned. I think the sale of cosmetics that are based on nanoparticles, where you know the nanoparticles can penetrate not through the skin and can move around inside the body, is really quite serious. The problem with nanoparticles is that compounds that are inert at the macro level suddenly become very active at the micro level. I mean, gold, for example, at the macro level doesn't do very much, apart from make you rich. But gold at the nanotech does. Mobile phones are the classic example of an ICT, in this case, that's of benefit in agriculture. The role of mobile phones in connecting farmers to markets in places like Kenya is just phenomenal. Those are the technologies, and there are, of course, other interventions, and I'll do this very fast just to make the point, because I wasn't going to talk about technologies, but, for example, one of them is to get input markets going. That's the small stores where women, in particular, will sell small amounts of seed and fertilizer. Great innovation that's occurring in Africa. Another are output markets, basically little co-ops in which you store your grain and then go to market on the basis of the mobile phone information, so you know what price you're going to get. You can even sell your grain on the mobile phone before you deliver it. There are Kenyan Maasai who will sell their herds before they've even started to walk them all the way to Nairobi on the phone. Cut flowers on the lowest plateau. One of those greenhouses costs about $5,000. You can take the money back really fast. Innovation. This is on the lowest plateau. It's a wheat field with little trees growing in it. And I said, what are those trees? And they said, walnuts. I said, why are you growing walnuts? They said, there's a very good market in Singapore for walnuts. And you just have to think about how far the lowest plateau is from Singapore. Here, Rwanda, those of you who know, Rwanda Bourbon coffee is fantastic. Women in the villages doing the tasting, drinking the coffee, spitting it out, marking it on a sheet. In parts of the United States, you can go into a coffee shop and be very pretentious and actually order your coffee from a particular village in Rwanda. Finally, just to say, all of that, of course, is threatened by climate change. So there's another whole peeling off this Russian set of dolls is another whole issue to look at in terms of appropriate technologies. And that's very fast. You're looking at either stresses or shocks from climate change. The stresses come from something quite specific that's happening over time, and so you can target your adaptation. That's at the top. The shock is something that's unpredictable, which you have to tackle as it happens, but largely it's reducing the vulnerability. So one example, if you take Africa, look at the right-hand, or look at the annual if you like, look at the left-hand set of graphs. Very hot in the north and south of Africa, 4 degrees or so, look, north and south. Very dry, the brown colours in the bottom graphs. That's a stress. You know what's going to happen. It's going to get hotter, and therefore you can breed crops for that heat and drought. But often what happens is that you're going to have a big drought or a big flood in the same place with a greater frequency and intensity, but you don't know what's going to happen. And then you have to build resilient livelihoods. And that requires a different approach to development. Basically, it requires building diversity. So the appropriate technology has to be part of a diverse approach. There's a lady in the Sundarbans. She's got rice fields, but here she's growing root crops as well for sale in the market. She's got a husband who's growing, cultivating fish fry. He's also got a little bicycle taxi, if you like. He rides around the village and makes money out of that. And as I left the house and looked up, he'd got a solar panel on the top. And I said, "Why have you got a solar panel?" And he looks at me and says, "Make electricity." And I say, "Why do you want electricity?" He says, "Light bulbs." And I say, "Why do you want light bulbs?" He says, "So the children do their homework." And the point is that the children do their homework, they'll get a job in the nearby town, and there'll be another source of income. And interestingly, tragically if you like, that village was hit by a cyclone only about a year later. I still don't know what happened to those people or what happened to that village. But the point there is the technology is of a different kind, a different quality as a result of climate change. Final slide is the one that we're going to be working on over the next few years, is how do you take those innovations which work at the local scale and how do you scale them up? Is it by farmer to farmer? Is it public scaling up? Is it private scaling up? Is it public-private community scaling up? Is it co-ops and farmer associations? Is it franchises? And maybe we'll talk a bit about that as we go forward. Thank you.